So typical Orange Snood style, we like to start last, so I'm bookending Teresa here. Asked Linda, I gave her about 6 different titles, also typical Orange Snood style. I kind of ended up on the basic title, Run More Games. With the long subtitle, which we'll go into, community metrics, contribution metrics, and then supply and demand challenges that the community faces. For those who don't know me, been around for a long freaking time, 92. Wearing my first GC shirt that I dug out of the closet actually in 93. We're presently Orange Snood. We combined Team Snood with Orange Crush a few games back, and it works well for us, so we stick with it. We've run a bunch of games and a couple of half games. For this talk, I'm limiting the discussion very intentionally to the Bay Area game, not to slight anybody. We're not talking Shinteki. We're not talking Bath. We're just going to stay with the Bay Area game as its own little microcosm here. Full and half games only, and just from 92 to the present. These are the things I kind of know and was able to research. I didn't want to get outside my realm and get controversial. The goal of the talk, I don't have any solutions. It's going to be awareness. How we're going to get there. Lots of different sort of strategies, and in the end, we'll kind of talk about some challenges, and then maybe I'll throw out some possible solutions to some of the supply and demand things we're facing. But you can see it's kind of going to be a torturous route, so bear with me. We'll get mathy in parts, so we'll see how we go. So we all agree on sort of a basic definition of the game. Yeah, that's Mustafa, if anybody knows him. 18 to 30 hours, 15 to 24 clues. It's a gentleman's game. There's no prize for winning. It's a unified experience in some sense. You know, it's sight plus a clue plus a theme plus travel. Kind of is what people expect, talking about expectations, for a sort of standard game. And it's difficult enough, and the enough part is really important. And the reason we talk about this on GC, anybody can make a clue impossible. Anybody can make an 128-bit RSA encrypted thing and give it to a team. That's what we're going to do to slow down the lead teams in the Muppet movie game, so beware. But difficult enough is key, and that's a challenge for any game or clue designer. But there we go, we have a basic definition. This has some implications. A typical game is going to be limited to approximately 20 teams. Dragon Hunt, we ran 28. We were lucky. It didn't break too much, but that started to be a little too much treading through any given area. Small games also work. There's nothing against 10-game teams or whatever you can run, but about 20 teams seems to be a target for a lot of GCs. There's a barrier to entry to this community. The truth is not everybody's really going to finish or play in games, so why should everybody be allowed in the community? There's a run once and only once philosophy. It's like a wedding, as we've talked about before. If you want more people at your wedding, you have more people at your wedding. You don't get married twice. And another key implication is this is a team-based event. I can't go up to a GC and apply as an individual and get shuffled off to some team. You apply as a team, and that's kind of a key implication in how the game community works. There's some major implications, and these are not so subtle ones. And the first one is the game community really relies on internal contribution for its ongoing survival. Cannot stress that one enough. We don't have an angel, we don't have investors, we don't have government funding. Without teams becoming GCs, there's never going to be a game. Without teams willing to play and trust in a GC, there is no game. In the end, we all have to realize that the consumers of the game community have to give back to the game community. And this is really, your thing you give back is your time. And that can be helping, play testing, GCing, somehow running more games. So how much contribution? Time to get mathy. We'll distill the formula in a second, but I've been wrestling with this one for a while. I'm not mathy myself, so this is a stretch. But the idea here is we've got a required contribution factor that everyone's got to bring in. There's an attrition multiplier in there. So my contributions have to somehow equal sort of an attrition factor, and we'll go into that in a bit, times the demand divided by the community resources. The attrition factor, I just want to talk about that for a second, because it's an important fact. If you take this equation, you look and go, hey, there's 20 teams, I only want to play one game a year, so I'm just going to run one game every 20 years. Nice. We haven't been around that long. But, all the power to you. I hope you don't wait. So let's take another look at that. So you distill it down. It basically says, if you've got an attrition factor of about 2, as a multiplier of 2, maybe your team's going to be around 5 years on average, is what we've kind of seen in an influx in the game community. We multiply that by a desire of 2 games played per year. Seems to be the average team. They like to play about 2 games a year. We divide that by 20 teams in a game, and we get sort of a contribution of 1 game every 5 years. That's what you really need to be given back to this community. And I'm just going to say that again. 1 game every 5 years. That's a lot. And we'll come back to this. So, we'll get mathy again later. So let's talk a bit about the social and all the implications. What are the reasons to not be a GC? What are the reasons to be a GC? This is a GC summit. A lot of people maybe didn't think about this and just went for it. I've done that myself. There are a lot of reasons to not be a GC. It's hard as hell. It's a time sink. If you've read the blog, you've seen this graph before. But this is what I expect my life to be going through the fall of this year. The gray at the top is sleep. The blue is my game involvement. The yellow is my life. And there's a reason you don't run 2 games in a row. You're recovering. Okay? It's a resource hole. Your hobbies, your job, your life, your family, everything suffers, especially your sleep. It's expensive. I know as a GC member, I lose $1,000 to $3,000 every game I run. I don't mind. It's a hobby. I enjoy it. But it's expensive. It can shatter a team apart. This is a very real thing for all prospective GCs to wrestle with. Teresa's been through it. I've been through it on Know Nothings as well. So you have to really wrestle with that. And there's a bunch of excuses. I'd rather play. I can't pull off the complexity. I don't have a big enough team. I'll argue against that because I've been on a couple GCs now where we've only been 3. And then another one you hear is, man, I'd never be able to do this as well as them. Well, I'll tell you, that's always going to be true. I don't expect to really ever be able to pull in the number of actors that Team Snout can pull in a given game. That's okay. This is the game I'm running. It's going to have my taste, my flavor, my style to it. It doesn't have to be the same as everybody else's. So a lot of reasons to not run a game. Not so many reasons to run a game. There are intrinsic motivators, and these are important. You get the warm and fuzzies because you're giving back to the community. You get to influence the community direction, and this is an important one. If you've seen a couple of stylistic games that are very similar, maybe you can come in, Ghost Patrol, and try something different. You get to try these different things in your life, experiences. Maybe you've never done industrial design on a product before. Hey, you get a chance. It's fun. It's an excuse, basically. And for some of us, you get to experience that game-like fun for months. This is a play test we did for Over Nightmare where we slammed that pumpkin open, and I was ready to go, and it was a blast. So those are a couple reasons intrinsically to run a game, but how about extrinsically? There's really one that has motivated GCs over the course of time, and that's typically they get a higher likelihood of future play. I say typically because it's not always the case. And it only works if the community favors those who contribute. So let's talk community structure now. How does the community encourage people to sort of step up, take that nasty burden that is being GC? Well, let's take a little historical approach. We've got the game community back then. I'm talking early 90s. 2 central tenets to the game community that sort of exist now and still exist. There's no central governing body. Anybody can run a game. It's a team-based event. It used to be a lot more underground in an isolated student community. It was a team captained by invite only. GC would fill to cover losses only through attrition or graduation. And new teams were typically heavily indoctrinated and trained by GC so that you had sort of a high quality of teams coming in. There was also a protected captains list, and that served a few functions. One was a pre-qualified, that GC handoff from one GC to the next was always sort of a pre-qualified handoff. You wouldn't just hand that captain's list over to anybody because you never really know what's going to happen at that point. So there's sort of you have a dinner, you talk, you make sure they're legit. You also kept the numbers in check with this captain's list. You made sure it didn't grow to be 80 teams or something insane. And then there was sort of always the threat of a quiet blacklisting of a team that was irresponsible to the community. That little check was an important one. It kept teams honest. You wouldn't mess with clues. You wouldn't destroy things. You basically wouldn't be an asshole. I like to talk about feedback loops, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot in regards to the game community, actually for about 10 years now. We're all familiar with the feedback loops on a team. You've got essentially usually a captain and a core team of players, and any one of them can be a captain at any time. Nowadays, it's more of a designation of the guy who gets shucked with the work of finding a van and all that. And often a team will have a couple players that you rotate in and out depending on either performance, behavior, how well they get along with the team, you name it. There's some feedback loops there, right? If the team likes the player, you're going to keep the player and keep them in the core. If the team doesn't like the player, they're not really invited back again. Now let's talk about sort of the GC team interaction there. There's a sort of interesting feedback loop that goes between GCs and teams, and we've discussed it tonight. From the team level, teams want to play, but they also have to be willing to trust GC with a good solid weekend of their time and a chunk of their cash, and their safety, as we've also discussed. GCs need to be aware that they need an audience. Without teams that are capable and willing of lasting 30 hours, they're not going to have a game. So they actually have to respect the trust that teams are showing them. And Curtis's open letter nailed this one right on the head. There's that feedback loop here. There's a mutual trust that goes on. You violate it and something weird gets something gets weird and out of kilter. So in a community sense, there used to be, or I don't want to say used to be, but there's a sense that by favoring those that contribute, the community actively encouraged teams to step up and become future GCs. We see here we've got a team falling out due to attrition, loss of numbers, whatever. At GC recognizing that, bringing in a new team in the fold, the numbers stay constant. The game through the 90s and maybe the early 2000s existed this way very stably. It was a very stable system. Teams would come up, step up, play. The numbers were pretty fixed. There wasn't over competition. And that's sort of where it was statically till, I'm not going to put a year on it, but somewhere after 2000. Nowadays, there's still no central governing body, and anybody can run a game. So the core tenets of the game are intact. It still is team-based, but there's definitely more player intermingling. Instead of just straight-out attrition, what we've seen in the case of Orange Snood is we've actually taken two old guard teams, we've shoved them together, and we've kept our numbers in check. So there's been sort of an intermingling and some player hopping between teams, and all that's good. The game community is also a lot larger. There's been a lot of crossover between the different communities, and we'll discuss that in a bit. The game process tends to be more of an open invite with an application screening. The community is really no longer actively restricted in size. And completely dropped off the list on the communities, there's no more protected captains list. Just not there. And so all those things that were sort of feeding these feedback loops, they don't exist anymore. So this brings up a couple of challenges. First of all, with an open captains listing and an invite process, there's sort of a reduced ability to control irresponsible community members. I don't mean to say this is a bad thing. I'm just be aware that if there's an asshole on a team somewhere, the community really can't regulate that as well anymore. It's going to be something that we're going to be wrestling with as a community. There's also sort of this growth that's just uninhibited. All these new teams have been welcomed into the into the game community fold. We got numbers growing. And then in sort of less important one is there's no more ability to validate up-and-coming GCs. And the reason I say this is less important is it really hasn't been a problem because being a GC is such a pain in the ass that it's self-validating. We've also seen, in the challenges section, the application processes. It takes sometimes longer to complete an application than it does to play a game. Applications also can be at risk for selecting for the wrong criteria. I don't mean to, I know Snout can take it. I've actually told Curtis this, but if you look at the Hogwarts application process, as a side effect, it's selected first come, first serve, perhaps the most competitive of teams. By the time we woke up in the morning to start our app, it was done. So, we have to be aware as a community what our application really serves to do. And we also have to watch out for an application process that risks failing to favor those that contribute back to the community. Because then we risk getting people to step up and be GCs. And finally, another minor challenge is the player intermingling. This community is decentralized. It's really hard to track at the player level. It's one thing to track 20, 30, 40 teams. It's another to track 200 to 300 individual players. It is also difficult because there's no direct feedback loop between GCs and players. It's GCs to team. And as soon as you try to go GCs to player, that means you have to invent a process whereby players can apply and then get set onto teams. And I'm not sure the community really wants to have that structure. So let's talk a little bit in detail about the crossover challenge that's facing us right now. Crossovers increase the community popularity and size. That is true. But we have not seen an increase in contribution back to the game community. And I'm referring once again to the Bay Area game community. So we have many other very vibrant communities that have sort of joined together, speak, crossover amongst each other. There's recycling of players and ideas, and it's a great, wonderful, vibrant community. But we're seeing it sort of at the expense right now of the Bay Area game. And there's the proof. So this number we just heard from Ghost Patrol really isn't 60. It's really around 47, if I'm correct on that. So I'd heard 60. I put it there. But we look at the timeline since 91, one game, all the way out to maybe this year. I've done a few things for you. One, I've sort of taken a stab at what we thought the number of active teams were. The bump right here is Dragon Hunt when we took 28 teams. I'm not sure what the team number was before that. It was hard to track. Maybe it was 28 at the time. But I know at that time we had about 28 teams active, and it's grown steadily ever since. But the number of games has not changed appreciably. If anything, you could say it's almost decreased. We see one solid game a year and maybe a half game as well. The other troublesome thing, over 50% of these games are run by repeat GCs. And I fudged that number a little bit because I included Orange Crush and Orange Snood sort of together under one flag. I did the same thing with 5 Blind Boys. We probably could do that with Ian Tullis in a couple of cases, but that only inflates the numbers more. So what you're seeing is we're not getting enough new GCs running games. So all you new GCs out there, it doesn't have to be a perfect game. Just step up and run it. It doesn't have to be something that takes your life. Step up, run it, spend a couple months. We'll be happy to play it, and you'll learn from it.
One thing to add to that.
Yes.
You do not have to run a bang or some 4-hour event before you run a 24-hour game. You
Yes.
can jump right in and run a 24-hour game as the first thing you ever do. And I think now that the bangs exist, a lot of people feel like they have to get their feet wet with that first. And I don't think that's true.
No, I totally agree. I firmly believe in rookie GCs. I think Rat Race was probably one of our better games in terms of logistics, and we didn't know anything. We didn't really get to talk to former GCs. We were running kind of blind from one example. We'd played in one game, and it still worked out. So don't be afraid. Don't think that every game has to be wild and open. You look at Paparazzi, their very first game that Double X Rated ran, and it was just tremendous. So there's a lot of examples of first-time GCs running fantastic, fantastic games. So Goonies was another great game. Excellent theme from a team that, you'd played 2 games?
No, we played 5.
5, okay. So this is where I'm getting that mathy number that we're not running enough games early enough in our game career. If you're waiting 10 years to run your first game, you're not going to really help. You need to be running it, and maybe think about running it in the first 3 years of your sort of team incorporation. If your team's not playing in enough games, run a game. The community should reward you by accepting you in the future, right? And that's the community's job. You see a GC run a game, you should give them priority because that's what's going to get this to maybe march up and allow us to grow. So let's move on. My goal here was awareness. I want all members of the game community really to be aware of the underlying mechanics that support this community, have kept us alive for 15 years plus right now. And we need to act accordingly to ensure its ongoing health. And I'm going to give some possible solutions, and they're separated into 2 categories. And don't shoot the messenger here. I just throw some things out. These are community solutions that we could do. Hey, we could limit the game community, clamp it down, 20 teams, that's all we got. We could redefine and branch the community, try to stop the crossover thing that goes on and really kind of limit it up. We can also choose to reinvigorate the feedback loops and kind of GCs just say, you know what, we really do need to, no matter what, even if we don't like that team or whatever, they belong in our game because they've given back, they've bled, they've sweat, they've done everything to give back to the community. Back to this mathy equation here. It tells you a few things. If you expect to play in fewer games, If you only expect to play in 1 game a year, your contribution factor goes down. If you expect to play in 3 games a year, you best be running a game about every 3 years. It's a burden. We can try to run bigger games. It's been done. It's hard. Sometimes they just break. And the other solution is basically just in general as a community, get out there, run more games. So I like to finish with a great quote that we're just embarrassing me here. Curtis gave us all, which is being a GC is not a debt that can be repaid. It's a tradition that we carry forward. And as always, like everyone else in the community, if you need any questions on running games, I'll admit to everything I've done wrong, and we're actually going to start blogging about that because I've got a history of doing things wrong. Give me a ring or a holler, and I'll do my best to answer. So any questions?
Wasn't focused on this, but I think it is important to look at the number of smaller games and see that because actually as a player I would take a lot more smaller games at the expense of fewer long games, and I think if you double the length of a game, it more than doubles the amount of time and effort and everything you need to put in. So I think encouraging people to do those bangs, to do those smaller events. And those smaller events, you can also you can have a lot more people participate and make everyone very happy, and so I think that's important to get people to put on those smaller games as well.
I'll just respond. I totally agree. I chose to only look at the game community because just the demand within that community and that expected community alone is vastly exceeding the supply. Smaller games may reduce the demand, but I suspect that's not the case. We could probably run 4 full-length games a year as a community and fill every single spot.
I think what I have to say kind of piggybacks on that a little bit, which is that there was a comment made earlier, and I think a lot of agreement around the room, about the fact that you don't have to run a full-length game, or you don't have to run a small game before you run a full-length game. This was our first game that we ever ran, and it was a full-length game. And for me, and I think at least 1 or 2 of the other folks on my team would say that they would have rather run a small game first. Because what happens is you basically devote a year of your life to something that you don't know whether or not is going to be successful, and that's really hard. So even if it's just to sort of understand a bit more about the logistics of running an event and sort of what everyone's strengths and weaknesses are on your team, I think it's worth it to run a small game. And I don't know, I just think that, yeah, there's definitely value had there, and I don't want to just let that go without being said. That's all.
I would never discourage anyone from any excuse that gives them to run a game, of any size. That is awesome. So this is not a rebuttal. I just want to contribute my experience to the discussion. I have run full games. I have run half games. And the half games were not significantly easier to run.
I actually agree. We spent as much time, if not more, on Overnightmare, which is technically only a half game, as we did on Wonka.
I agree, yeah. So I would suggest considering a fuller game, as it's not really that much more daunting than running a half game. And to contradict myself for a moment, I find as I get older and need more sleep that the half games are more appealing. So ironically, half games can help draw more people into the community. I don't know what their mathiness is for making more games, but
more
I'm not really sure what it
run
says.
Games.
I think one of the points that we're all trying to make is as a prospective GC, you should push yourself a little bit. You think, oh, it'd be so fun to run a game, or oh, I don't know if I could do it, or whatever. And with the bang community, we have this sort of fallback. Oh, I'll run a bang. It's just a couple hours. It'll be easy. Running games isn't easy. That's not the point. The point is to push yourself. And maybe starting with a 12-hour game, maybe it's a great way to go. It's more than you probably thought you could do. And it's enough that the hardcore gamers will really appreciate what you're doing. And like you said, it's not necessarily easier. It is easier in some ways. Not having to deal with the overnight aspect, I think, takes a lot of logistics out of the game. That's probably the biggest one. So.
So I'm going to inject another one of the groups that was explicitly out of scope into scope here and say, I just kind of want a gut check sense on how are we invaders from the north perceived in the San Francisco game community. Like Seattle teams, right? I mean, it's really, really hard to run a game. I've seen it done from Seattle to Las Vegas. I've seen it done, other pairs of cities. But it's really hard to run a remote game. So would the expectation be that we can all pay for a $300 flight on Alaska to each other's cities? And does that kind of count? Just gut check, right? Does that kind of count as repaying the community? Or do we need to find some way to put a cell membrane around each city and figure out what the equilibrium equation looks like?
I'd love to go to Seattle.
Yeah. So I don't think there has been one, at least not to my knowledge, since Moon Cursor. But there are some of us that are kicking. Yeah. Right. Yeah. See, we don't like invaders from the south. That's okay.
I think another part of that, yes, it'd be really fun for me. I've never played in a Seattle game. I think that'd be really fun. I'd love to do it, so do it. But the other part of that is a trend that we're starting to see a little bit more of, which is the simultaneous running of games in multiple cities. Doing a joint GC between Seattle and San Francisco, or even bigger. There's puzzle communities or burgeoning puzzle communities in cities all across the country. So that's another thing to look into. Find a GC, if you're in Seattle and you see this presentation and you want to contribute, find a GC down here and work together to run the game in multiple cities. And that's going to inherently increase our formula thing.
Has that ever been done for a long-form event, like 12, 24, 30 hours? I don't think
Not
so.
to my
It's always
knowledge,
been
no.
the short ones, right? Yeah.
Well, there's the Microsoft hunt coming up. Yeah, but that's a conference room game.
So I have a suggestion too, which is,
Gotta be recorded because
let me get the microphone. We're talking about the demand and how people go to run a 24-hour game, and then there's 40 applicants, and they have to turn half of them away. And we talk about what the barriers to entry are. One of the things we didn't talk about is money, the barrier to entry. Why don't you run a 24-hour game in Chicago or New York, and the people who are that desperate to play, that are willing to pay that much to fly to New York to play and then pay for the event, that'll limit you down to 20 teams, But I think at this point with the game community the way it is, you'll get 20 teams in New York who are willing to fly out. Very little doubt that you could just run a game in any city you want, and people from all the communities and yeah. But I'm just saying, it's one of the ways to limit your number of teams is to make the game maybe harder to get to, or the teams have to pay more to play in it, and that'll help.
Can I just say though to that, the point isn't necessarily to limit the games. It's hard, but maybe to run enough games so that the demand gets spread out across the games in the year. I don't think a lot of teams necessarily want to play in 6 games in a year. Maybe they do, but maybe they'll just say, no, we're not going to allow that as a GC. You've played in 5 this year. You don't need a 6th. So instead of restricting the quantity, we've already got this community that's huge. Let's think the other way. Instead of restricting down, let's think, hey, how do we just try to get more of these events out, just overall? There was a time in the game history when everyone wanted to play in every game because the evolution was such that you didn't want to miss a single clue. We're now at the point where we've seen a lot of the same clues across multiple games and stuff, so that time's maybe past. Now it's a time where you want to maybe be transparent, select the game that's more your style. So what we need is more GCs to go, you know what, I'm just going to go for it and run one. It is possible to run a game in 2 months. It is. It may not be the world's best themed game. It may have a lot of paper puzzles, but you know what, it'll be a challenging 24-hour event that can take you to some pretty cool places. So that's why run more games, please.
So one of the points you're making is, if I'm running GC, I should, bluntly, I should know who else has also been a GC, who's given back to the community, and I should, look favorably upon them. One way that's hard, though, is if I'm a brand new team, and in part, I may not know most of you, and in part, frankly, what have you done for me lately?
Yeah.
So this is a challenge. I don't know what the right answer is, but it will be I would think it's a hard sell to a new team to say, oh, and by the way, you have to let all of us, old guard people in. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
I have some, because I've been rejected from enough games as a GC who just ran one prior. I was talking to Brent earlier. I've been a hypocrite and rejected GCs from games because I didn't think they would be a match for our game. It happens. But in general, we've always tried to favor, our team. This is a team philosophy. I can't argue for every team. We've always tried to favor a team that's bled for the game. They've put their heart into it. And there's a back end from doing that. When they play in your game and shit goes wrong, because it will, they will help you fix it. They've been through it. They'll tend to be nicer on the phone, more respectful. They'll make your life easier. So there's other benefits that happen by including people who've done it. You don't have to include everybody, but you want to sort of do that. Otherwise, you run a game, you bleed and you sweat, and what if you never get into another game again? Great, nice. You leave the community, you're done, you're not happy. So as a community, if we want to survive, we have to sort of value people who contribute to this community. Otherwise, people run games and they'll disappear. And we've seen GCs do that over the past, where it probably just obliterated their team. The Biohazard game, the espionage game, there's been several examples where GCs have just completely been obliterated by running a game. So it's something to, look at and just evaluate as a community. I'm not saying I have the answers. I'm just saying this might be a key to get us to get more GCs to step up.
Please run a game and obliterate yourself. No, wait, no.
It's a good way to deal with too much demand.
It is.
Teams will merge. There'll be fewer of them.
It is definitely difficult, though. I mean, we're all relative newbies to the community, and so we don't even know who all did what games, 8 years ago. Mm-hmm. But of the ones we did know, we had probably, if you count teams that some of the guys helped out with moon cursors or whatever, we had like 15 of our teams were previous GCs, and that we didn't even play in their games, but we know that they did something, and we didn't feel like we could have our whole game just be, oh, you guys are already the community, and this is for you. We're new, but hey, check us out. We wanted to really bring in new people.
Yeah, definitely. Run more games. I mean, that's going to be the answer. Not every GC is going to get into every game. Not every team is going to get in every game. You got to run more.
What are your thoughts on old guard versus new blood? Because, we specifically were trying to bring in new blood, and a lot of new blood were brought in are saying, oh, I'm so excited now, I want to run another game.
Yeah.
Versus the people who were there before is like, well, we ran a game before, you owe it to us to let us in because we've already contributed. How do we decide, do we reward the people who contributed, or we try to get more people in who may contribute in the future?
I don't think I can answer that. I think Teresa nailed it. They had interviews. You try to see who's a match, and you do your best. And you let people in as you can, and you recognize that not everyone's going to get in. And honestly, a lot of the old guard, as we say, we're pretty adept on landing on teams. So, although Orange Snood may not have been in Ghost Patrol, specifically, I ended up on a totally rookie team with my sister's team and had a great time. So it's dedicated game players will find ways to play games, but what we need to do is allow this large quantity of teams enough opportunities so you don't have a team play once and then never get the opportunity to play again because they only have one game on their resume. And that will be used against them. They need to be able to build more experience. They need to be able to run a game and then have an opportunity to play as well.
So one thing that comes to my mind is I guess a lot of the teams are very cohesive, and then the team goes on to run a game. But there are a lot of other teams that are more, they come together, they play the game. There's not necessarily the people on the team would be great people to put together a game. So it's very hard for some of those types of teams, and Radix is being one of them, to, as a team, put on a game. So I think it'd be interesting to have some more ideas. I'd love to hear ideas on how to build a game control-centric team to come together, put together a game, and then go off and scatter back to your own separate teams that might be very differently structured.
I have one response to that maybe some other GCs have seen. You know that thing when you're starting to play a game, you go, maybe we should run one that's sort of like this? That's the spark that turns your team into a game control team. If you start talking about running a game while you're in the midst of playing a game, it kind of infects you a little bit. It might take 2 of those games, but it's effective. And Teresa's got.
I want to respond to that, actually. So from my personal experience, Orange Crush probably played in 5 or 6, maybe 7 games as a team, and we never, ever had team dynamic problems. We were all really good friends from college. We got along really well. Running a game destroyed our team, and the reason why, half of our team had no idea what they were committing to. I mean, they knew. I mean, we had a plan, and they committed to building clues and finding sites, and it didn't happen. And 2 to 3 of us bared the brunt of the entire game. And honestly, looking back on it, it's kind of amazing we pulled it off. Fortunately, we are all still friends, but we will never play in a game again. And so I would definitely agree that your game team is not necessarily your game control team. But I think you can figure out how to, I know that with Ghost Patrol, I think it was 2 teams that came together and ran a game. I think there's ways around that. But I think in the same way that you're spending 30 hours in a van with people when you play a game, and you got to pick those people wisely, it's 1,000 times the case when you're running a game. Because you're not spending 30 hours together, you're spending a year and a half together.
Yeah, I would recommend flirting a lot with your prospective GC members. By that, I mean Teresa and I, we talked about running a game as Combined Orange Snood for years. And then we took a year to select a theme. This wasn't a light endeavor to pick the Muppet movie game. We really thought about it. And we're only a subset of our actual playing team that's running it. And these are the people who know what it's like and are dedicated. That's the actual core. The rest of our team members are by far welcome to contribute a clue, build up a site, help us out. But my experience, having run several games, and this is funny because I know it's directly contrary to Snout's experience, is I like small cores, 3-core GC. Wonka was pulled off with 3 people, 0 helpers. The logistics of the inner dynamics of a GC are much easier to deal with when you don't have to send constant updates and schedules and reminders. Dragon Hunt was all about schedules, updates, reminders, and trying to get 7 people to see the same vision. And so there are lots of different ways. You can combine 2 teams. You can have a GC of 10. You can bring in helpers early. You can stay small. Whatever works for you. You can be 1 person if you really have the dedication and drive to do it. So the GC doesn't have to be defined. It can be whatever works for you. You just need a couple of people and enough fuel on your fire to get it going. Brent, I think? No.
I'm going to steal it. Real quick comment, and it won't be funny in 30 seconds. For some reason, 12-man cores work really well in Seattle. Insert your favorite Microsoft joke here.
No joke.
Actually, I have a question for the Microsoft end. So one of the points that you brought up in your presentation was there are some teams don't really exist as a cohesive team. Some of them are 1 person and 4 friends of the week. And but I'm curious how this might change. Asking the only representative from the Invaders of the North, does this change at all in the Seattle area? I know with the strong, for example, the Microsoft Puzzle Hunt tradition, that I don't know. Those are 12-person teams rather than our more typical 4 to 6 player teams. Are the groups up in Seattle larger, more cohesive?
Yeah, so that's actually kind of complicated, and in fact, there have been events whose sizes have been designed in the Microsoft Puzzle community at large to be relatively prime to the other previous sizes. I think it was Iron Puzzler had 5-person teams, so that you were kind of forced to either augment your traditional 4-person Puzzle Safari team or take a weird subset of your 12-person Puzzle Hunt team. So we do kind of play with mixing teams up. I'm affiliated with a 12-person entity, a 6-person entity whose population is made up entirely differently. And when I actually had a Microsoft card key, it was easy for me to play on a 4-person entity in the Puzzle Safari format. So Seattle has its own kind of concentric circles, I guess, or Venn diagram of puzzle communities. Microsoft is kind of an epicenter. Google has started, I think, having that branch out quite a bit. And I think I had one more point in there, but I've already forgotten what it was. But yeah.
So I wanted to ask a bit about your decision to talk about the community as the game community, just being the one circle, because I think that the way I look at it, and I'm interested to see how everybody else thinks about that too, is that the community today is the bigger one that includes all of those circles. And so I almost feel
is
like...
Is it, though? Not to interrupt, but
yeah.
I mean, the question is it? Is it really? Because the game community is different from the Shinteki community in the sense that the expectation is different. When you play in a Shinteki, you expect something different than when you play in a game than when you play in a bath. They're actually they serve very different expectations. And some people may go between them, but I personally only play in games. I'm not really a hardcore puzzler. I don't play in baths. I like the game. I like the expectation. I like the format. So there's a lot of crossover, and they're almost bled together. I fully agree. But there are different sort of, when you say a game, you're not thinking 12 hours in a conference room on a website. There's sort of that gestalt that you're after.
I think a lot of people would consider a Shinteki a half game. I mean,
yeah.
And I think that people draw the lines in different places. And so, for the people that do look at all of these sort of, more as, almost different formats of the game, you kind of have to then make a choice as to where do I want to contribute, and if I contribute in that circle, does that mean that I'm excluded from that circle, that sort of thing. And
I have no answer for you on that one. Yeah, that's why I very clearly said up front that I can only want to consider one community, because if I run bats nonstop, can I play in 6 games a year if there were 6 games a year? Is that really fair to that community who's doing, say, something slightly different? I don't know. There maybe there is no answer. Maybe it's just one giant community and we just see it as that way or not.
So I'm actually thinking about an answer to that.
So I like the game. I like Bang too. I kind of like, I'm not totally into the puzzles. I like a break between puzzles. There's this thing coming up, this Microsoft Puzzle Hunt, where you get a puzzle and then your reward for solving it is another puzzle. And then there's another puzzle.
6 more puzzles if you're lucky.
Oh yeah, a lot of puzzles. And I'm like, I don't want to do that. That's not my idea of fun. So I'm volunteering to help to run it because it's the event that I don't want to play in. So,
I like it.
So if you try and think of the bigger community, and if you're thinking, what's this Bang thing? 4 hours, I'm just getting started then maybe run a Bang and kind of think, there's enough people with enough overlap of interests, they'll probably remember that I helped to run a Bang and they'll let me into a game.
Nice. Cool. Thanks, guys.